Connection, the Congress of Trade Unions, housing NGOs such as Peter McVerry, Simon, Focus, housing activist groups such as Take Back the City and many others are calling for a major national demonstration here at the Dáil to demand emergency measures to deal with the spiralling housing crisis. Those protests follow what I believe to be the magnificent protests of mostly young people in the Take Back the City movement who have occupied scandalously empty properties that could be used for housing to highlight that obscenity of people suffering homelessness while residential property or property that could be used for housing lies scandalously empty. And let's be clear, Taoiseach, these protests are not protests for the sake of protesting, but they are driven by intense frustration at your government's continued policy on relying on speculators, vulture funds and corporate landlords to solve a housing crisis that those very people created in the first place. A failed policy that continues with the Land Development Agency initiative, with the continued sale by NAMA of public land like the John Player site, scandalously, with Section 1110 tax reliefs where billions are going into the pockets of vulture funds, of LEHAF and HIPFI where we are financing private developers to build, in some cases, on public land and to run away with the profits and charge astronomical rents and property prices, and all the while obscene profits made while the housing crisis gets worse and worse and worse, and the human misery that it causes continues. Now, Taoiseach, these protesters are demanding a change in policy. They are saying, stop selling public land to vultures and speculators, start an emergency programme to build public and affordable housing on public land, introduce rent controls, adopt robust, aggressive measures to go after empty residential property where there is no justification for that property sitting empty, to house those that need housing, to stop evictions into homelessness. Nobody should be evicted into homelessness, and to establish a constitutional right to secure and affordable housing. Now, Taoiseach, don't you think that rather than seeing paramilitary policing methods with balaclavas against peaceful housing protesters, young protesters in the main, some of whom were hospitalised after such was the aggression used against them at those protests, and recognising that your policies have failed to address the deepening housing crisis, that maybe you might listen to the demands of those protesters? And indeed, would you, while you're at it, repudiate the unbelievable suggestion by the Minister for Justice that the police should no longer be recorded in the conduct of their duties, when that amounts to censorship of the press and the public in terms of their right to oversight over the sort of heavy-handed policing tactics we saw on North Frederick Street?
Thanks very much. Deputy, protests aren't going to build any houses. But government will build houses, and the private sector will build houses as well, and that ultimately will be the solution to this problem. In terms of protests, as I said earlier, protests are part of democracy, and protests are welcome. They are part of a healthy democracy. However, protests should be peaceful, and they should occur in accordance with the law. And I hope you will use the opportunity of your supplementary to echo that sentiment, that protests should be peaceful, there should be no violence, and they should be done in accordance with the law. There are no government proposals to restrict people from taking photographs or making videos. That would be a restriction on free speech and not something that I would support. And I want to reassure people of that, press photographers, individual citizens, protesters. There are no government proposals whatsoever to do that. But I hope also in your supplementary, when you affirm your view that peaceful protest is the type of protest we should have, that protest should happen in accordance with the law, you'll also take the opportunity to condemn any abuse of the Gardaí, racist abuse, name-calling, and I hope you'll use the opportunity as well to condemn anyone who seeks to identify and intimidate online members of the Garda Síochána, because that is not the kind of behaviour that should happen in a decent society or a healthy democracy. Gardaí are people who put their safety on the line to defend our democracy, to protect our freedoms, to keep us safe and to police our communities, and they deserve our support. And I really hope you'll use the opportunity of your supplementary to reaffirm your commitment to ensuring that protests are peaceful, that they happen in accordance with the law, and that Gardaí are not subject to verbal or physical abuse in any way whatsoever.
Barrett.
Unreservedly, any threat or use of violence against anybody by anybody, whether it's against Gardaí or against protesters. But will you condemn the use of violence, actual violence, not threatened violence, actual violence against wholly peaceful protesters, some of whom were hospitalised with concussion, cuts, bruises, had to get stitches as a result of the violence of hooded Gardaí and private security who used excessive violence against peaceful protesters? Yes, the government should build public housing, as you say, but your own department's figures, which I looked at to refresh myself last night, show that between 2011 and 2018, your governments have built 2,827 council houses. In the same period, the housing list has gone from 96,000 families to 136,000 families when you include transfer lists. When you include transfer lists of HAPS and RAS, which is massaging the figures, Minister Murphy, 136, and the number of people in emergency accommodation has quadrupled, and we have the shocking obscenity of children and families in growing numbers in emergency accommodation.
Over time, Deputy.
That is a policy that has failed. And unless you address it and stop with policies that continue to hand over billions in tax breaks, land, property, cash, as you're proposing to do again with the LDA, to private speculators and landlords, you will never solve this crisis. It will continue to get worse.
Taoiseach, can you conclude, please? Thank you.
Absolutely. As I said earlier, in relation to the occupation of vacant properties, City Council, the county councils have the power to CPO properties. Many councils are doing that. If they're not CPOing a particular property, I assume they have a reason. Many of the properties being occupied are in the Dublin City Council area, a council that is dominated by Sinn Féin and left-wing councillors. You should ask them to give an explanation as to why these properties are not being CPO'd. In terms of building social housing, that's exactly what the government is doing. We've set aside funding to increase our public housing stock by 110,000 units over the next 10 years and 50,000 in the next 5. We increased the social housing stock last year by 7,000. And yes, that includes direct bills and approved housing bodies like the Ivy Trust, been providing social housing in Ireland for a very long time, and it includes the council buying properties off developers. It's all social housing, belongs to the council. People are given secure tenancies, 7,000 last year alone. Will be more again this year. We'll ramp it up to 10,000 a year. We'll provide 110,000 additional social housing units over the next 10 years. That is our guarantee, and we're making it happen already. What would be helpful would be if Sinn Féin and left-wing councillors didn't vote down social housing in Dublin City Council and South Dublin County Council. You'll have your reasons. You'll have your reasons. If you were,
can we have order? Can we have order, please, for the Taoiseach?
If you were as concerned about, if you were as concerned,
please,
if you were as concerned about these issues as you'd make out, if you really want emergency measures, tell your own councillors not to vote against any social housing under any circumstances.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Can we have, please, member?